Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa taslim ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Are we now live? Stay here. Okay.
I'm a gorilla.
Okay, finally. So we're live on YouTube now. If Hamza, you can just confirm it on the YouTube chat, inshallah, and then I can begin. So just introduction first. The reason we're late today is because this little person over here managed to pull all the internet wires out just as soon as I started streaming. So he is to blame entirely for it. I'll still wait for confirmation though, because I haven't. Some people are saying they're finding it difficult to get online. Oh.
And go away. I'm going to little please. I'm a robot. A robot alley.
Okay, that's fine. Brilliant. Okay, if you can hear me, that's fine. Excellent. Sorry for the delay. Like I said, the culprit is here.
The police car.
This is for switching all, pulling all the wires out. Okay, you can be quiet. So inshallah, today's discourse, now that we have a start, it's on YouTube today. From now on, inshallah, we're just going to host it on YouTube. The reason being is because we get a clearer stream on YouTube. And unless there's a discussion going on, it will all run through YouTube, inshallah. And more people find it accessible on YouTube anyway. So today's discussion, it's a bit, I won't say it's clickbait, but the title needs some expansion, I need to unpack the title. I titled it The End of Knowledge. There's a reason for that as well. Once I kind of get into the topic, you'll inshallah understand why I've titled it that. But what I probably want to begin with is why it's important to discuss the topic, and kind of what kind of draws me to kind of to discuss this kind of or what drew me into this discussion itself. So I'm coming from perspective of number one, a teacher, a student, and kind of a person who loves education, loves knowledge, loves studying, loves reading. From that perspective, and also viewing kind of the change in trends, and especially a change in the way we process information as well. You gotta go now, okay? Okay, go. Off you go.
I can't do it.
You gotta go now.
No, I can't go.
You can't do it. Okay. So this is going to be a bit difficult today because he's stuck to me today. So hopefully he'll behave.
No,
People are listening. Okay. Now I want to begin with a quote from Neil Postman, which I find to be, and I'm going to base it in and around that. So he is noted to have said that as culture moves from orality to writing to printing to television, its ideas of truth move with it. And those four things that he picked, I want to base my structure of what I'm going to discuss on that. And that's essentially about the way we see the way we view knowledge now is different to the way it was viewed before. I want to begin with Socrates and a discussion about Socrates.
Yeah.
I don't want to bore you with any details, but there's something very important about what he said. So in the era of Socrates, it was an era of discussion, debate, critical thinking, and deep discussions as well. You didn't have a textbook era in that period. So when books were disseminated in his period and books were viewed as a source of knowledge, it really troubled Socrates. And the reason it troubled Socrates was because he thought that if people begin to read books and concentrate on books, it will take away from the idea of critical thinking and the idea of thought, that people will just read books and just take what's within that book as what we call gospel now, or as truth. So it really troubled him, and that really interested me, because what actually troubled Socrates was that people would stop thinking. That's what troubled him. Of course, if Socrates were alive today, he'd be horrified by kind of how we view knowledge now. And the reason I want to begin with that is because historically, great thinkers have really valued the idea of truly or deeply understanding something. It carries a lot of value. Abu Hanifa said, for instance, when he was talking about knowledge, he said, if the kings knew what we had, they would send their armies to take it, or to usurp it from them. So historically, great people that we know of now were essentially great thinkers as well. And great thinkers, their ideas were anchored in kind of deep understanding and deep reflection. And so I want to begin with the idea of what knowledge is and what knowledge was in according to the Prophet ﷺ as well. So the Prophet ﷺ, he defined knowledge as at times differently, but definitely we have the dua of the Prophet ﷺ, I seek refuge from knowledge that doesn't benefit me. So we have this idea of knowledge being something that directly benefits us, that we and Imam Ghazali said something really interesting. He said, al-ilmu bila amalin junun wal amalu bila ilmin la yakun. The idea that knowledge without action is madness, essentially, and knowledge and action without knowledge doesn't take place, meaning that all action is based on some form of knowledge. But it was an idea that knowledge is required, that one requires knowledge to do things, and if one just has knowledge, it's by and large pointless. I read somewhere today that a saying that I don't know who the saying, who the person was that said it, but he said that there is no difference between a person who doesn't read and a person who can't read. It's very interesting. I found that there's no difference between being illiterate, or although literacy has 2 points to it, but there's no difference between somebody who cannot read and somebody who does not read. But anyway, I want to we'll get to that, inshallah. Information on knowledge, I'll talk about that. Now, I want to talk about several things or different layers, inshallah, today. But I want to talk about my frustration first. And this is individual frustration. I don't know if anybody shares it, but I have, as a personal experience, over the last 20 years or something odd, witnessed a decrease in value for knowledge and value for the kind of rules and regulations that govern our idea of sacred knowledge. That's definitely true. But also I've seen a destruction of the idea of learning. And this is something very important. The center of my discussion will be the idea of learning and what it means to learn something. So we historically have always understood learning to come from learning to come through a process, that you learn something from somebody that's more learned. That's the idea, that knowledge is passed on. Somebody does the hard work, and then you take that knowledge from them, and then you add to that, and then you continue that kind of chain. And that's with all, by the way, I'm not talking just about religious knowledge or sacred knowledge, if you want to call it that. I'm talking about knowledge in totality. That knowledge or information that's valuable has always been received, added to, and then disseminated, and it just keeps going on and on. But there's been a drastic change in that, and obviously my discourse will be on Islam, kind of sacred knowledge, of course. That's what I want to focus on. But I'm just saying we see a decrease in the idea of learning, full stop, and the value of learning based on its rules and regulations. So I want to talk about these 4 stages, and I want to begin with this idea of orality. That knowledge begins many thousands of years ago, probably, as an oral tradition. In fact, in the early period of Islam, we have studies now in maybe the 4th century Hijri, in and around that 5th century Hijri. If you count the amount of libraries that the Muslims have, the amount of books they have in their libraries, it far outnumbers Europe. That we had libraries that had hundreds of thousands of volumes of books, whereas Europe had very few and far between. And we know the educational class, or the standard in the Muslim world at that period, was much higher than that of Europe. So, but it began with an oral tradition, and the idea of transmission through writing occurs. For Islam, luckily, we went to Persia, and Persians already had an established tradition, and we adopted that tradition, and we began to write books. And in the Arab world, it wasn't, of course, the Prophet ﷺ, that entire period of time was an oral tradition. I want to talk about writing a little bit before we get to printing. Now, interestingly enough, we still read books that were written 700, 800, 900 years ago. There's an advantage to that, and there's a disadvantage to that. That Muslim scholars that we now still rely upon wrote these books maybe 600, 700, 800 years ago, especially the classical texts. Now, it's good to gauge their understanding of that period, but there's a problem with it as well. That if Muslim scholars after them didn't develop those thoughts and add to that, then it becomes pretty much stationary and stagnant. And we do have a problem in Islamic scholarships, and I'll dedicate another discourse to that, where it seems that development in certain areas just stops. Then we get to kind of the printing era, and the printing era is where we assume that if we mass distribute kind of texts, that literacy would improve, and to a degree it was true. We had an educational revolution. Especially Europe, the amount of the literacy level just went up further and further. Education then becomes obligatory. Everybody's, especially in the last 100 years, post World War II, everybody must be educated in school, learn to read and write. And this is why, interestingly, in Spain, homeschooling is prohibited, because in Spain, in villages, people are still not sending their kids to school for them to kind of work on the land. And so there are still areas in Spain where you have people who are illiterate. And so the government put a ban on homeschooling for that reason. Here, homeschooling is completely different. But now what Neil Postman talks about, moving on to the 4th stage, which is the 4th stage is television. I'm going to adapt that slightly and change that to kind of digital learning and where we're at now. And this is what I want to talk about. Currently, I believe that Muslims, or us as a Muslim, how do I put it? I don't really like the word Muslim community, but us as Muslims, you could say, are at one of the lowest points in our history in terms of Islamic literacy. Islamic literacy currently, in my observation, and in my own observation, and probably the people I talk to and I engage with and have been doing for, let's say, at least 2 decades, literacy is not on the up, it's hugely on the down. And how we know that is because scholarship is slowly disappearing, and it's being replaced by a very bad second-rate or secondary form. And I want to give examples of that and break that down and try to connect that to these hadith of the Prophet ﷺ as well, and why I feel this topic is so important. We currently have several ways of, or sources of, or way of sourcing knowledge. So I want to go through them. Number one, your source of knowledge may be the masjid. Now, we all know that this is probably the weakest form as a source of knowledge. Why? Because what do the masjid offer currently? Well, they probably offer a good education for learning and trying to understand Quran, meaning not trying to understand, sorry, trying to read Quran, number one. Aside from that, the only real education from a masjid you're going to receive is maybe a Friday khutbah, and you may pick up a couple of hadith, or to be fair, people are kind of rushing out of work and trying to rush back, so I don't know how much attention people pay. I give a khutbah as well. How many people actually take from that? Allah knows best. But a few kind of sound bites you take from that. So masjid is not really a source of knowledge anymore. It was before. I mean, the Azhar, for instance, the famous Islamic Institute, or Zaytuna in Tunis, or the Karawiyin, the durus were in the masjid. And the reason for that breakdown is partially political. Definitely, there's politics involved in the Muslim world. Outside of the Muslim world, I think that we've misunderstood the kind of what the masjid's for. And there are many other reasons. I don't really want to go into that. Another place or source of knowledge is, for instance, schools of learning, institutes, and seminaries, call them madrasas to a degree. Now, this one's quite complicated because we've had a rise now in the last 10 years of institutes, online institutes, on-site institutes, virtual versus on-site. And they seem to be the source of, assumed to be the source of most people's learning, but that's another mistake people are making. They're not. I believe the single form of the majority of knowledge that Muslims acquire now is the internet. And not only do I believe that, the big data suggests, quite clearly proves that. Most of our knowledge now is taken from the internet. These are just simple facts. And by that, I mean your Facebook post, your Instagram picture, your Twitter feed, your Googling of my husband said talaq to me 3 times, but he was angry, am I divorced? To your, I'm having a Facebook argument in the comments page, so I need to try to research as much as I can so I can reply to it, which I'll get to later as well. All of those things are normally searched on Google. Now, does that mean it's a bad thing? Not necessarily. I mean, Google is a fantastic source of information for a lot of things. And Neil Postman commented on that as well. He said that let's not kind of be absolutists that assume that technology will better education necessarily. There are pitfalls to it as well. So this third form or source of information, although it's useful, but it's incredibly dangerous and problematic. We all source our information. I want to get to the root of the problem, though. We do source, or it does act as a source of information. I remember, I don't know if you recall it, there was a program on television. I think it was EastEnders, actually. It may have been EastEnders, I can't remember. But it was a program on television, and there's some kind of a Muslim skit on that, or a portion, and they went and Googled if some, I think it was a reality show actually. They Googled if something was halal or haram. I can't recall what it was. And they came up with Ask the Imam or whatever. And they said, oh, look, there you go. It's I don't know if it's haram or halal. Now I'm going to talk about the pitfalls and the problems and possibly some solutions and why we're headed towards the end of kind of quality Islamic learning, why we're heading towards the end of that. And what's going to happen next after that, which is quite scary, actually. The problem with it is as follows. Number one, it's teacherless. There's no teacher there. There's an entity that you assume to be telling you the truth, an algorithm, a personless Unicode. You're just on there and you can see text. That's all you can see. You assume the people behind the text are reliable, but you don't know. There could be anybody, or you could have verified them, but your verification is as far as a person's recommended them. You can't go on TripAdvisor or Trustpilot and look for reliability here. That's the difference, you see. These are not products that we're testing. This is information that we're taking to be affecting our faith or not. So what's a consequence of that? And I want to kind of now look at the consequence of what monster this has created. Let's get to YouTube now. This has now created monsters. If you go onto YouTube, And I'm not a very polemic person, to be honest with you, nor am I like sectarian. But I'm going to be a little controversial without mentioning any names, at least. And the reason for that is because I want to highlight the problem we have. If you go on to du'at, this new word, this kind of invented word that, and they use this word du'at where, and to be, it has its uses as well. I'm not saying it doesn't have its uses, but callers, people who call to something, Islam. Internet's full of them. If you look at the most popular ones in the English language, you'll see that their age range is from anything from 18 to 30. Or they may now be 27, 28, 29, but they started YouTubing at 21, 22. And their videos have 70,000 hits, 75,000 hits, 150,000 hits, some of them 500,000 hits. But the irony is that they are so ignorant that they wouldn't pass an introductory exam to a basic course. I'll give you an example. Take a ma'had, a school in Syria. So they have different programs in that particular school in Syria. You have the ma'had, which is like a secondary school, which you can enroll at a very basic level and then build up and become quite advanced. So solid 6-year program. So there are prerequisites for that, Arabic language, other things. But take a takhassus program, specialism program. They would test you, some more rigorously than others. They'll test your tajweed, your background knowledge of grammar, etc. Most of these guys would fail entry exams to even basic programs. And I mean fail. Here, I'm going to mention some anecdotal kind of instances. I'll mention a couple of them. One of them, for instance, was, I watched this clip, was talking about, and I did like post this on my Twitter feed, about the graveyard. I just saw this clip, I was kind of astounded by it. And he was talking about the graveyard, that whoever goes to a graveyard and calls the people, talks to the people, whoever attempts to go to a graveyard and talks to the people that have passed away, has committed shirk al-akbar, that has committed like major shirk, kufr. Now, I don't know if he said it in a moment of anger, passion, confusion, ignorance, all together, which probably will sum him up. What's the irony there? The irony is that that's exactly what the Prophet ﷺ told us to do. When you go to the graveyard, you address the people in the graves. Ya Ahl al-Qubur, O people of the grave. Now, that type of mistake is not uncommon. YouTube's full of it. But this is the very kind of Islam that produced it, kind of the internet Islam. This kind of idea that anybody can just learn this stuff, it's easy. But the problem is not that. The underlying problem is when people feel that they can speak before it's time. And this is the second issue that I want to get into. Becoming learned or learning about Islam does not give you a right to speak. And this is something very, very important. There's a difference between knowing something and speaking about it. I'll give you some examples of my own kind of story. My teacher, my main teacher, and anybody who studied with him will know this, he was incredibly critical. He was a very critical teacher. He was somebody who would criticize his students a lot in private. And he would also he was quite harsh with us in terms of mistakes and things of that nature. But also, he was very careful about you talking about certain things that you were not qualified to talk about. And he was very careful on allowing students to teach, very careful about it. And so this discussion about ijazah, for instance, permissions, was never a discussion. We never ever had this discussion. I never felt in my entire studies that I had to ask him for permission. When am I going to get my ijazah for this? That wasn't on the table. That wasn't a table discussion of you could ask for permission to do this or to do that. It was assumed when your training's finished, your training's finished. I remember one of the ulama, one of my own teachers actually went and visited, and he was a qualified scholar, erudite actually. He went to visit a great scholar of Damascus. He's passed away now. His name was Sheikh Suleiman Wahbi al-Ghawji. He was Albanian originally, then migrated after World War II. And he visited him, and he wanted he had translated a book and he wanted an ijaza in, or a chain of narration for that original book. He didn't have the chain. He didn't need it. He just translated it, but he thought it'd be good to have it. And Sheikh Suleiman was quite reluctant. Obviously, he knew this person, and this man was a scholar, but he was reluctant. And when he asked him why he's reluctant, he said to him that he said something along the lines that قد قرأت كثير من الكتب, that I read a lot of books, so a lot to my teachers before they gave me any permissions. This idea of training, he did give him the permission at the end of it, but he was incredibly reluctant because there's a huge difference between training and what we have now as handing out ijazas like sweets. The first example I gave was slightly different. It's somebody clearly that's just an ignoramus, completely ignorant. He may have some bits and bobs of knowledge, a weekend course or this, or studied al-Waraqat in a basic text, maybe turned a few pages in the Arba'un of Imam Nawawi, has no real rigorous study, but feels that he has to go and convert the entire world or correct everybody. That's just an ahmaq. But this particular trend we have where people are going out there and trying to gain ijazat, permissions from teachers, and they've been given, this particular case was a scholar, and that scholar was reluctant to give it to him. That's another problem that we're facing now, where people are putting false biographies up saying they got permissions from teachers, but they don't have any training. What does this result in? This results in all the mess that we currently have on the internet. A lack of Islamic learning, people talking without knowledge. And that comes back to my original point, that just because you've studied something doesn't give you permission to speak about it yet. You may need age for that. And this brings me on to my third point of how is education or Islamic learning related to age? This is something very, very important. In our tradition, we had an idea that knowledge was age dependent. Teaching and learning was also age dependent. And what I mean by that was that ulama did not allow young people often to teach or to go out and disseminate knowledge. They didn't allow it. I've heard so many stories of ulama where there were younger scholars, and if there were other scholars teaching in a particular area, they would have to get permission from them before they could teach. It just was not allowed. In Damascus, they would not wear turbans, the turbans of scholars, until they reached the age of 40. There was this idea of responsibility where you had to go through the stages of acceptance. Cambridge University still has it. I mean, to be head of a faculty, you just don't get to do that. And unfortunately, that has disappeared with the death of the ulama. In a few minutes, I'm going to get to that hadith and why this is a little scary now, where we're at currently with when it comes to knowledge. What has this led to beyond this? It's led to argumentation, and this is for the generality now. And I'm going to go to the public now, how this affects the public. The public now, like I said, Islamic literacy is probably at its lowest. It's been for forever. I mean, we haven't had it at this. I haven't seen it at this rate. Why? Because it's coupled with the idea or with arrogance. I want to quote a verse in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, وَلَقَدْ صَرَّفْنَا فِي هَذَا الْقُرْآنِ لِلنَّاسِ مِنْ كُلِّ مَثَلٍ وَكَانَ الْإِنسَانُ أَكْثَرَ شَيْءٍ جَدَلًا. Surah Al-Kahf, Allah says that we have placed in this Quran every type, we provided every kind of description. Meaning in the Quran, we've given so many different variants of things so that you may educate yourself, so you may learn. If that doesn't unlock it for you, this example will. But then Allah mentions something that's general. Allah says, وَكَانَ الْإِنسَانُ أَكْثَرَ شَيْءٍ جَدَلًا, and that's what I want to get to. Let's take all of our experiences now. Go on the internet, bring up Islamic topics, 6,000 comments, 1,000 comments, 1,400 comments. Take a tweet, for instance, that somebody said to me. He said, if you want to be successful in Twitter, I'm not a type of guy who's very good at communication. Everybody knows that, who knows me. Some people will be laughing right now. So I said, I don't really care about social media and Twitter. Sometimes I put something up, I couldn't care if somebody interacts with it or not. They said, but if you have to remember, Twitter is a place of controversy. People will only interact if it's controversial. The irony is that's against our tradition. Allah says human beings, this is interesting, أكثر شيء جدلا, are the most argumentative of all things. God doesn't even mention other, like human beings are argumentative. He says of all things on planet Earth, human beings are the most argumentative. And this is where education knowledge completely disappears. That commoners now are all over the internet, sprawled all over the internet, arguing about the faith, Islam. The problem with that, of course, is the fact that there's huge weight on their shoulders now on the Day of Judgment. But the fact that they're slowly, incrementally, gradually destroying this faith now. Because they're the ones who are representing what people see out there. Now, I want to talk about what responsibility we have as, let's say, or the public have about learning. Every week I have people asking here or sending me divorce questions. I have them all the time. I want to ask you a question here. If you're asking me about divorce questions, some of them may be scholarly. But if a person doesn't know that if he's given divorce to his wife, it's actually a divorce, that's a problem in your learning. If people don't know the absolute basics of Islam, whose fault is that? Let's just ask ourselves. Who's responsible for our learning, considering so many institutes are available now? And there are still scholars out there. It's the fault of the people. You can't blame anybody else. And I want to begin with the idea of literacy in the Quran. How many people out there from the general masses can even read Quran properly? Whose fault is that? And I want to be quite serious here. Is it the fault of, because ulama always criticized, of course, people of learning always criticized. But when will people take responsibility for their own learning? How many of you can read Quran properly, for instance? If you can't, that's not good enough. That it's a wajib. It's obligatory to be able to read the Quran properly. You're reading God's word that He revealed in a form that it wasn't revealed in. Number two, your basic necessary knowledge, 99% of the questions that I'm asked all the time. Whose responsibility is that? It's not the job of the ulama to do open Q&As for everybody. It's the job of the public to have the basic kind of level of Islamic learning. Where is that? And who's responsible for that? The public are. So when somebody arrives that's completely ignorant and the public begin to follow them, the public have to take responsibility to a degree of that as well. And that's my point. I want to get to what the Prophet ﷺ mentioned about this and why I fear now, and I'm worried, of course, like many other people out there are, of what this is going to lead to. I want to begin, before I get into that, something interesting. Just something quite interesting. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ about the end of times. By the way, this is not entirely related, but I just want to throw it at you. Okay. And he said, alayhi salatu, khayru ummati qarani, thumma alladhina. Then he begins the hadith. He says, khayru ummati qarani, the best of my community are my generation. Okay, the ones that, and then those who follow them. ثم الذين يلونهم. Then those who follow them. That's not what I want to get to. Then the Prophet ﷺ said that people come after, and he could be referring to the end of time in the middle, but it seems more apt for where we are now. And he describes them in different ways, but I want to give you some description that just stuck out at me. He says that they will testify, but their testimony will not be accepted. Then he said that they will take a trust, but they will dishonor it. They will dishonor their promise or break their promises and dishonor their trusts. Then he said, alayhi salatu wasalam, he said, وَيَظْهَرُ فِيهِمْ السِّمَنُ or السَّمَنُ. When I read that, I was like laughing to myself. He said, and obesity, obesity will become worldwide. Or obesity will affect, it's not a thing, but will affect people worldwide or be common. When I read that, I thought, What has obesity got to do with anything here? And of course, we know that obesity is often related to being lazy and procrastination and all of these things. But it's incredibly interesting that being overweight, of course, is a huge problem. But I just wanted to throw that in there for everybody. If you want to sign up the Day of Judgment, being overweight is one of them. Just thought I'd tell you that. So, and everybody's going to say, but all the Maulvis are overweight. Well, I'm on the same side as you. Whoever's overweight, then you should be sorting that out. I want to get to the hadith on the Prophet of the end of time. So there's a hadith of the Prophet. I begin and I'll quote quite a few of them. He said, "La taqumu as-sa'a," at the end of the hadith, "hatta yuqbatu al-ilmu," that the hour will not come until knowledge has been. Now, qabd means this: if you qabd, to take something by your hand, until knowledge has been snatched away, you're taken away. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Inna min ashrati sa'ati an yataqarab az-zamanu wa yanqusu al-ilm," that the Day of Judgment will not come, the hour will not come until yataqarab az-zaman is differed upon, but I would say until time becomes very things happen very quickly, i.e. time seems to pass without being able to record it. And we all can feel that, and I think I discussed that last week. And then he said at the end of the narration, he said, and knowledge is taken away. In another narration, he said, and yurfa al-ilm wa yathbutu al-jahl. And this is interesting because he talks about a replacement of knowledge. He says knowledge will be taken and it will be replaced by ignorance. Ignorance. I.e. that, and this is where I want to get into the question about information that was asked, that knowledge is replaced, but has to be replaced by something. And I want to talk briefly about information and knowledge here. For us, in terms of Islam, knowledge is a sacred idea. It's something that relates to faith and something that relates to human change of spiritual change. So knowledge for us is sacred because it changes something within us. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, "A'udhu billahi min ilmin la yanfa." I seek refuge from knowledge that doesn't benefit me. So knowledge for us is something very special and sacred, and that's why it requires all these rules and regulations at times. Information now, it's taken on. I mean, if you've read any studies on the disappearance of, or on the introduction of kind of information, there's loads of books on it about this, but I recommend something sometime in the future. But information for me is what we do on our phones. It's where we read a clip from a kind of excerpt from an article, read a meme, and assume that we're learning things. That's information. And what it's replaced is learning. Learning is where we actually are reading something to acquire something that's deeper, that stays with us. It's completely different to information. Information is something that's easily forgotten, by the way. We experience it all day long. The irony is we probably do more reading overall than in the past, meaning how many messages do we read a day? How many things do we view? Now, there was a wonderful study done on this in Susan Mind Change, in Mind Change by Susan Greenfield. Can somebody correct me on that? In Mind Change, she wrote something very interesting. She said, the way we read now and process information is different to before. So I'll give you an example. Let's take a book from here. Let's take take Plato's Republic. Okay, so if I open this up now, the paragraph that's in front of me here, which states, "For that reason I said the good judge must be old, not young, a late developer when it comes to discovering the nature of injustice." Now when we look at that, she talks about studies that have been done on neuroplasticity. Yes, Susan Greenfield. And she says when we look at a block of information now, and I think the guy who wrote, I'll remember his name. Now anyway, so she says that when we look at this paragraph here, we no longer read the whole paragraph. That when we look at information now, we actually look at that paragraph and our eyes look to scan common words. Common words. So we look for common words and then we just make connections, i.e., even the way we read now is not the same as before. That we don't even read entire paragraphs. We actually just process common words and their connections. That's how far, or that's how much of a change, mind change there is now. That even the way we read is different. And that's the whole definition of information v knowledge. That even the way we read now is completely different. And the proof of that is, look, I do it myself sometimes when I'm looking at a message. If it's long, I probably won't read it. I'll probably just look for common connections. But if we're doing that in absolute terms, then what are we really learning? So it's being replaced by that idea that we're not really learning anymore. How many times have we said, there's a book and we'll just watch a video, or we'll just, do you have that in? So it began with the replacement of documentary. So I'll give you an example of that. Do you remember when Dan Brown released his first book, Da Vinci Code? So I was in Syria. Somebody said to me that, yeah, look, I'll just wait for the movie to come out. This was in like 2004 or 5 or something. Now, but that's true. Like, if the movie's coming out, are you going to really read the book? Now, the irony is, a movie is about an hour and 15, 20 minutes. If we can get, like, movies are a bit different with the entertaining, but imagine there was a documentary. Say, can I get that in like 30 minutes? Like, my threshold is 25 to 30. But let's be absolutely honest. Like, we as an organization, like we release stuff and people are telling me in marketing that, look, your videos need to be 50 seconds. Because that's the amount of time you have to capture an audience. You need to be a minute and a half. You need to be 2 minutes. Which shows us that we're at the end of knowledge, i.e. we're at the end of true learning. Where we're at now is gimmicks and information bites. It's disappeared. And we're going to look at that a bit more in terms of who's representing that form of knowledge now. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, said, alayhi salatu wasalam, that inna bayna yaday sa'a ayyaman yanzilu fiha al-jahlu wa yurfa'u al-ilmu wa yaktharu fiha al-haraj. He said that close to the day of judgment, meaning close to the end of times. And this is unbelievable, the words. I don't know if the Prophet ﷺ was inferring something here. I don't know. But this is just my take on it, okay? Just my take on it. He said, ayyaman yanzilu fiha al-jahlu, that knowledge will descend. I don't know if this is linked to the internet, because that's what we do, you see. Knowledge is put in and then it's downloaded, you see. Yeah? So, you know, download, tanzil you have in Arabic. They have tahmil as well. That's the word for download. It's interesting. Why would the Prophet ﷺ use those words? Yanzilu fiha al-jahlu. Knowledge will come downwards. You see, i.e. will be downloading ignorance. The ignorance prior was just an absence of knowledge. The word jahl in Arabic means absence of non-knowing. But here, knowledge is used almost as information. In this narration, yanzilu fiha al-jahlu. Now, this is my take on it. Take it or leave it. But it's interesting that the Prophet ﷺ did not say here that people will just be ignorant. He said knowledge will descend, it will come down. Now, I think it truly could be related to internet. That all that information is actually just pure ignorance. Like Neil Postman said, he said, when we shift from kind of the oral tradition to writing, to printing, to television, to internet now, don't think that the substance changes. Don't think that substance doesn't change. That substance does change. It changes entirely. Now, I don't know. Then the Prophet ﷺ said the following. He said, وَيُرْفَعُ الْعِلْمُ. Now this is wonderful, because this is actually plays into my first point. He said, وَيُرْفَعُ الْعِلْمُ. Knowledge will be taken up. Now we know in other hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that the Prophet ﷺ said, knowledge will not be taken like away just like that. So there's an explanation of these hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said knowledge will be taken away by the death of the knowers, the ulama, the ones who know. Obviously, what's interesting here is that we have this idea of souls being taken up. So people will die, that's a worldly thing, but they'll be taken up. So for وَيُرْفَعُ الْعِلْمُ وَيُرْفَعُ الْعِلْمُ, the knowledge will be taken up. So we have this kind of the taking away of souls of scholars, and what's coming down now are these kind of information bites, or this information which is being downloaded into people's minds, which is completely ignorant. And we know that with mass media and things like that, where we're giving fake news, as Trump puts it. But it's true. Now, the Messenger of God said in other hadith, added one other point to it, and this point all constantly comes with this disappearance of knowledge. وَيَكْثُرُ الْهَرَجِ. Said, "O Messenger of God, what does this mean? Haraj with a ha, not with a ha." He said, "Al-qatlu al-qatlu." That wherever these hadith, by the way, when you find the disappearance of knowledge, you often find in these hadith also this statement, that killing will be widespread. Maybe that's linked to the idea that it's senseless killing. Because we have this wonderful hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where he's sitting with the companions, and he says, he talks about this killing, this mass killing. And they said, "O Messenger of God, do you mean by that, like when we go to war, when we, obviously people die when wars occur, that when we fight the enemy, is that what you mean?" He said, "No." He said, "A man will kill his neighbor, a nephew will kill his uncle, an uncle will kill his nephew." And they couldn't believe it, because this is senseless killing. Why would you do that? And they said, "O Messenger of God, will they, on that day, will they have their senses?" And he said, "No." He said, "Such that a man will do something, and after he's done it, he won't know why he did it. He won't know why he did it." And this plays into, or this kind of adds that detail. And we're almost at the beginning of that stage, senseless killing we see all the time now. And those people who say, "No, you know what it is? There's just more media attention." It's not. I was born in the early 80s. I remember people being killed. It was nothing like this. 15, 14, 13-year-old kids were not stabbing each other to death. It just didn't exist. It's not that the media is shining their light on this. It's a very, very new thing. It doesn't have a precedence. It just does not. Young children were not killing each other. Adults were killing each other, maybe late teens and onwards, yes, but not 11 and 12 and 13-year-olds. It didn't exist. This may be the senseless killing that the Prophet ﷺ is talking about, and it comes hand in hand with this ignorance, hand in hand with these young preachers on YouTube, etc., hand in hand with a mass kind of disappearance of knowledge and people wanting to study. And I'm going to get to that as one of my final points. Then he said, alayhi salatu, added other additions to that. He said, "And yurfa al-ilmu wa yathbutu al-jahlu." In this hadith, ignorance will become he uses another verb, yathbutu. Ignorance will become a firmly established idea, meaning it's people are not getting out of it. It's there now, just the way of life. And then he said, "Wa yushrabu al-khamru wa yadhhuru zina." That alcohol will be consumed and everywhere. وَيَظْهَرُ zina, and zina will be everywhere. Now, there's an interesting point to both of them as well. This is my observation. You can differ with it if you wish. But when I was growing, when I was younger, and those people who grew up in that period will know that Muslims, as bad as they were, wouldn't drink publicly, or drinking wasn't a massive thing. I don't believe it was a big thing. It was there, but it wasn't big, and they would definitely not do it publicly. Like people wouldn't, when in Ramadan, they wouldn't publicly show that they were not fasting. Even the fusaq. Now, of course, that doesn't exist. People don't even care anymore. That's added to that. So it could be in relation to it be just open. But the next one's interesting. وَيُظْهَرُ zina, and zina would be zahir. Now, it doesn't say zina would be widespread, but zina would be apparent. Now, this could be related to pornography. Could be that zina would be viewable. It could be, yudharu zina, that it could be seen to be zahir, because zina was something, remember, fornication was something hidden behind closed doors. So for it to become zahir, they can only be zahir in two ways. Either people are talking about it, or you can see it. Now, it seems quite clear that there's an indication there, for me anyway, that this is indicating pornography. That wa yudharu zina. Allah Ta'ala a'lam. Now, in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, hadith Tabarani, يأتي على الناس الزمان لا يدرى فيه ما صلاة وما صيام وما صدقة. And this is back to the point of the public, that a time will come when people will not know, or salah is not known, nor is fasting, and nor is sadaqah. Sadaqah is reference to zakat, most likely, that these things are not known anymore to people. Now, are we at that period or not? Allah Ta'ala alam, but I think if we're not, we're incredibly close. Now, I want to talk about another hadith that I found, although it's a bit controversial in the sense that some of the ulama consider it to be a good hadith, others have criticized this chain, but I think personally it's perfectly fine, and we'll go with that. And it's this hadith about the Prophet ﷺ talking about certain types of people that God dislikes, you could say. Now, the Prophet ﷺ said, and this really struck me actually, the descriptions, how accurate they were, that Allah does not like the following types of people. Let me get to the hadith. Here it is. So, number one, or there's a few points to this, a few types of people. So you have Allah, the Prophet ﷺ mentions, you have the Ja'dhariyun and you have the Jawwav. Number one, somebody who has bad manners. A Ja'dhari is somebody who has really bad manners. God doesn't like that type of person with bad manners. Number two, a Jawwav is a person who walks arrogantly, who thinks of themselves as something that they're not. But number three is quite interesting, that the Prophet ﷺ mentions al-sakhab fil aswaq. Now this really struck me. A person who argues, the loud mouth of the marketplace. The loud mouth of the marketplace. The one who goes to the marketplace and argues with everybody. I'm going to take this to also apply to people on the internet. Because aswaq are places where all the public go, where they can view things. So I'm going to take this also to apply to the internet. That the loud people who comment, that argue on the internet, I believe that this wording also applies to them. To all those people out there that do these, that behave in that way on the internet. They also fall into the sakhab fil aswaq. Then the Prophet ﷺ said, the person who is himar bin nahar, that he is a donkey in the day, meaning he doesn't fulfill his obligations in the day, and jifa bil layl, and he's like a dead body in the nighttime, meaning he doesn't pray in the nighttime. Alimin bi amri dunya, he knows everything, or he knows a lot about the dunya. Jahil bi amri al-akhirah, he's ignorant about the hereafter. And I found this to be quite astounding, because these are kind of clear descriptions of what we're looking at now. And it's all due to the absence of sound learning, or partially down to, sorry, not all, down to the absence of learning, or kind of true learning. In another hadith, and this brings me back to these types of, the Prophet ﷺ said that until there's no scholar left in the world, اتخذ الناس رؤوس جهالة, the people will take ignorant people as their leaders, these kind of, فسئلوا فأفتوا بغير علم, they will be asked questions and they will answer without knowledge. In the hot seat, they sit, these ignoramuses, answering questions, quick fire. They don't have any learning. The level of education behind their answers is non-existent. The irony is this: then you have people refuting them who are just as ignorant but don't know it. It's like jahal murakkab, compounded ignorance. Even the people trying to expose them are ignorant. Then the Prophet ﷺ said they are misguided, وَأَضَلُّوا, and they misguide others. Now, and in one narration he says they stand at the edge of hell calling people in. That's kind of the state of affairs. Where I want to finish this with, we're definitely here, by the way. You know, the great, in 2002, Sheikh Abdullah Sirajuddin passed away, a great muhaddith of Sham, a great man of learning of hadith and author of many books, prolific author. He produced great students. One of them was Dr. Nuruddin Aitr, rahimahullah, great scholar of hadith. I did not have the blessing of ever studying with him, but I wish I had the opportunity, but I didn't. He passed away. And when I was in Syria, I never really attended his classes. I was busy with my own classes. He had some public classes. But great scholar and recognized by all scholars. He passed away, I think last month or the month before. Who is he replaced by? We have some contemporaries. Sheikh Muhammad Awama, great scholar of hadith again, from the same group of people, very old. Who will replace him? There are people out there, some really strong younger scholars in their 50s maybe. But who will replace them when they die? And if anybody's in that field will know their expertise is slowly disappearing. It's slowly disappearing. The grade below, some people are still there kind of holding onto that kind of tradition and that level of ilm, but there are not many to hold on. We thank Allah that He sent us somebody like Sheikh Said Fuda that preserved our kind of field of ilm al-kalam. And there are some brilliant people also in other parts of the world that are in that field, but they're slowly disappearing and not being replaced. That's a state of affairs we have with ulama. And you can ask the ulama out there, they're saying exactly the same thing, that people are dying and not being replaced. What's the obligation on the public? Of course, to support and things like that, but to learn. Everybody out there, it's obligatory upon you. Obligatory. I went through enough ahadith that the public are also part of the problem because they have stopped learning, you see. And not learning also adds to the fact that ulama will disappear because there's no thirst for knowledge out there. The thirst that was there between 1995 and 2005 was not there between 2005 and 2015, and definitely is not there between 15 and onwards. So people need to be serious about learning. That's learning how to read the Quran, how to understand the Quran, by the way. Learning your basic Arabic is absolutely essential. I've told that to everybody. Everybody can learn basic Arabic and at least to access the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So today, it wasn't just information that I was trying to give. My main point was do not contribute to the disappearance of this sacred kind of responsibility that we have, of disappearance of the sacred knowledge, this responsibility that we hold. The Prophet ﷺ did say that the inheritors of prophets are scholars, but scholars only as good as those they have to teach. My teacher used to say to me all the time, he said a teacher is only as good as the students that he has. If his students are no good, or if they're not enthusiastic, then the scholars will slowly die away and nobody will replace them. So my kind of conclusion to all this is we are at this end point. However, take responsibility, every single person out there, and improve your Islamic literacy, because you will have to face God on the Day of Judgment and answer for that, especially when it's so readily available, and you have to be a bit more serious about it. And that's what I want the takeaway to be a bit more serious about learning and education. And it's not good enough anymore. We spend hours, wallah, in procrastination, al-ghafla. We all procrastinate, of course, I procrastinate as well. But there must be some seriousness in education, in learning. There's enough moaning and blaming other people, but everybody needs to take responsibility and begin to learn. God will ask you about it on the Day of Judgment. And I'm not the type of person, by the way, that goes out there and tells people what to do. But this is, I feel, is a responsibility that I have to say, that people are falling to the wayside, and your level of literacy is so low. It's unbelievable, and everybody needs to take responsibility and go out there and learn properly. Last week, somebody asked a question on here, and I said to Muhib as well, I said, you guys, I'm fed up of these questions. They're so basic that you should know these things. I shouldn't have to answer these questions. Go out there and learn your basics at the very least, and be strong in them and go over them and put them into practice. Sometimes I wonder what people are doing with their deen in day-to-day life. How are they practicing it? So the onus is on you to get your religious knowledge in check, so you can at least worship God correctly, and also so you can access the book of Allah, that you can learn your basics of the Arabic language, such that you can learn. Aqulu qawli hadha. We'll finish there, inshallah. I'll take questions now. Hamza, if you can navigate that for me. I think I answered the one from Tasawwur, I think. Difference between information and knowledge. If they're none, it's easier for me. But if you have any, you can ask, inshallah. Khair, I think we'll close up there for today. Brilliant. So I'll see everybody next week. I don't know what sorry for the late announcements, but I'll try to get them out a day or so earlier, but they will be quite late because it's so quick. No barakah and time it, so it's difficult to get things out. If you want, inshallah, if people want particular topics to be discussed, then you can either on the Dean Central Facebook page, on the comments, if you can put them in, the Dean Central Instagram page, please just under the poster, put any topics that you want to be discussed. If you got my number, if you don't, then I'm not giving it to you. Reach out to me or reach out to one of the students to get those back to me, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.